Welcome everybody. Can you hear? Okay, we're just going to start our webinar. We've had 150 participants register today, so we're pretty excited about this webinar and our guest Dorothy Badry from Canada. But first, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Jocelyn Jones, and I'll be chairing this session. As a Whadjuk Noongar and a descendant of Yagan, an Aboriginal warrior and traditional owner of the Swan Valley region, I would like to open this webinar. I acknowledge elders past, present and future and welcome you all to this meeting. Wanju Wanju, Nidja, Durbal Yerrigan Budja. So, just some housekeeping first. We're going to have time for questions at the end. There is the chat function that people can use to write their questions in as we go along. It's, you know, with so many participants and a short time, we're hoping that we can get to many questions as possible. We will be also recording this session. So without anything further, I'll introduce Dorothy. Dorothy is a professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Calgary. She is also a child welfare research lead for the Canadian FASD Research Network. Her research focus is primarily on FASD and child welfare, disability, advancing knowledge on FASD, issues of loss and grief, Indigenous concerns and FASD and international collaborations with FASD. So I'm going to hand you over to Dorothy now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Slides up to share, everybody, and good day. The presentation today is What's New, Current Research Updates on FASD, a Disability Rights Lens. And I would like to thank the National Drug Research Institute and Dr. Jocelyn Jones for inviting me here today, and greetings to everybody. Okay. Can't advance my slide. I don't know why. Sorry, technical glitch. I think right here, perhaps.
You just got to come out like that.
Oh, okay, thank you. Over here, okay.
She can't do the things.
We're good. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present, traditional owners and elders and families, particularly from Western Australia and across Australia. Families raising children with undiagnosed, with FASD and at times generational disability. I'm going to give a warning on sensitive material given the research that I did in terms of preparing for this presentation. Please note that this discussion involves cases that involve information about the early deaths of individuals with FASD. These cases offer important insights and lessons to systems of care and are presented to highlight key points for change. Systemic advocacy is a critical aspect of responding to FASD, and individuals with FASD have a disability that is not always adequately supported, and in contrast to other disabilities. And so it is critical that we talk about that because these individuals live an already challenged life. And so let's talk about what's happening in Australia and ways to go forward. Really important. A key message here is that there is no blame of anybody in relation to FASD. No blame of mothers who do not set out to harm their children or of individuals with this disability. My doctoral dissertation research involved interviewing 8 mothers of children with a diagnosis of FASD, and I completed that work in 2008. And what I can tell you about mums is that they're just really trying hard to live their lives, that they have a lot of untold trauma in their lives, and that alcohol was part of a means of coping. So we just want to get the message across very clearly that we can't blame anybody in relation to FASD, but we can do some things in terms of support and prevention. So the cases that we highlight here are about highlighting the need for critical education and FASD-informed care. We know that people with FASD do not always benefit from mainstream disability services, and that's something we need to talk about. And we need to consider what lives would be like for individuals living with FASD, their families and carers with built-in support that are FASD informed. I'm not going to read this, but all I'm going to say is can FASD or can FASD has a definition of FASD. But what's important to note is it's a spectrum disorder and that the presentation varies and many symptoms are not visible. It's also one of the leading known causes of developmental disability in the Western world and is actually higher than many other disabilities that we know about, including autism, including cerebral palsy, and Down syndrome. One of the key points here is that individuals with this disability have a right to have their disability recognized like any other disability. And areas where there's challenges really is in adaptive functioning and day-to-day living. But the other problem that individuals with FASD face is that they often go through life with a disability that is not recognized. And this provides a distinct disadvantage and really an aspect of unfairness in their lives, because people with this disability look to professionals to provide support, look to systems to provide support and care. And so, and individuals with FASD do not have the same level of advocacy for the disability as other disabilities, such as autism, for example, which is highly funded. We don't see the same strong advocacy voice emerging in terms of FASD. So it is therefore the responsibility of the systems and the people in those systems providing care to advocate for people with this disability. We actually need to put on our advocacy hats for this population and work in their interests. So when you have undiagnosed FASD, and it is important to consider the things that we need to do to recognize FASD. We need to think that the individual might have a disability, even though we don't know what it is. Things that tell us that they might have FASD is that they're easily influenced by their peers. That can be positive or negative. And so, you know, if you wrap around positive things around an individual and you support them in what they're good at, their strengths, they often really benefit from that. But if they're in situations where there's negative influences, those influences also are powerful. So it's important to consider the ways in which we support people. We have an individual who doesn't learn from past experiences. We have concerns about their mental health, mood swings, easily frustrated, often unpredictable, doesn't show up for appointments with their counselor or their therapist or their social worker or whatever helping person they're supposed to see. They might appear immature and act younger than their age. The family's frustrated, trying to do everything they can, and the individual is isolated. And that's often the case for people with FASD. When we did a paper in Canada that looked at the unique complexities of FASD, and when you look at this graphic, what you see is that, you know, FASD is clearly a brain and body-based disability known as a whole body disorder. So there is lots of underlying health conditions that often aren't recognized, but the unique aspects of FASD is that there is some social root to it. We have social determinants of health, we have intergenerational impacts, compounding stigma. Stigma should not be a reason to not diagnose or support individuals with FASD. Individuals with FASD face tremendous environmental adversity. They have other co-occurring health conditions often, and they have unique caregiver and family experiences. So stigma may, and some recent research in Australia by Panton and colleagues tells us that stigma may contribute to not providing a diagnosis of FASD. And so we're going to unpack that a little bit more afterwards. So we know that up to 11% of the population in child welfare care in Canada has FASD, 3 to 11%, and the global prevalence is estimated to be 7.7 out of 1,000. General estimates in the United States say about 4% of the population. So what's important here is that there's common comorbidities, co-occurring health conditions that are significant, including mental health problems, anxiety, depression, and a history of abuse and trauma is not uncommon in FASD. These families are often involved with the child welfare system, and children with FASD are often not raised in their biological families. Lots of trauma in the history, and what happens is when the disability isn't recognized, what we see in front of us is an individual who may biologically be 18, but really isn't functioning there. And when you see an 18-year-old, you expect the young person to act like an adult and comply with expectations. It is very difficult for an individual with FASD to comply with expectations without support. For example, attending appointments, navigating the rules, and failure to comply is often the reason people are excluded from services that they desperately need. We are a rule-bound society, and individuals with FASD constantly experience failure in helping systems where there is no knowledge about FASD. So this little graphic really does tell us that, we have varying levels. But we also look at really positively at the strengths of individuals as well, the ability to express themselves, and other strengths such as artistic, music. Important graphic when we're looking at social maturity and FASD. We have different models weighing in that are really important in relation to FASD. The biomedical model, where FASD was originally recognized in 1973 and 1968 by Lemoyne in France. We have the alcohol and our other drug sector. Addiction to alcohol and unplanned pregnancy are a significant problem that needs to be addressed. Social sciences, we look at FASD as a lifespan disability. But we also know we are 3 to 4 to 5 generations along with FASD, and we continue to not have the supportive infrastructure in place to support families. The social and emotional well-being posited by Pat Dudgeon and colleagues also offers an important framework to look at FASD. We know that these families and children receive far fewer supports than families with other disabilities. And I have to ask the question, is the disability FASD in looked after children overlooked in the systems charged with their care? And why? This is a question we need to ask ourselves. Individuals with FASD have the right to have their disability supported in the same way that other disabilities are supported. And it's also very well known that the Banksia Hill study showed us the highest prevalence rate in the world amongst youth, where 1/3 of the population had FASD, as well as other neurodevelopmental disabilities. But that study in particular was a hallmark in terms of saying, we have a problem here and we need to think about the best way to address it. The other significant issue is the legacy of colonization in both Australia and Canada, where I'm from, which has contributed to significant health disparities and systemic inequalities that impact First Nation people. Let me tell you a little bit about the Canada FASD Research Network. We have key roles in terms, our function is to conduct research, collaborate, and develop resources. And we've done a lot of work. You'll be able to check out our website and see the work we've done. We have research leads in the core areas of prevention. That would be supporting prevention of FASD and varying levels of ways to do that. Intervention, what is best practice? Justice, we know FASD intersects heavily with the justice system, and we have a research lead looking at that. We have the FASD database. We have over 3,000 records in our database, common data forms, that we can now do research from, and that continues to grow. And as of 2022, we now have Melissa Tremblay as an Indigenous advisor to Canada FASD. FASD in First Nation and Indigenous communities is reflective really of the overrepresentation of First Nations children in care of systems. And we know that colonization has a key role in relation to the way disability is experienced, but within Indigenous communities. And I know the term Aboriginal is utilized here more. So excuse my Canadianisms. From a child health and disability lens, children with FASD often get excluded, become isolated, and often do not benefit from mainstream services that are FASD informed. So we need to consider the systems and support for children with FASD, where they're located, where they're accessible. The legacy of colonization has compounded FASD in Aboriginal families, especially distrust of services, fear of child welfare authorities. There's research tells us unprecedented prevalence of disabilities, the existence of systemic inequalities and structural racism, the history of the stolen generations, and in Canada, the residential schools, and that disability and racism continue to have people avoid health and social service systems due to the historical fears around these systems and distrust. I've been working very closely, actually for almost 10 years now, with Dr. Robin Williams. You'll see her in the picture here, just to my right, as I'm looking at it. Other folks in this picture include Dr. Harry Blagg, Will Hayward, Donna Nelson, Dr. Vicki Russell, one of the first people I met who came to Canada from Australia to learn about FASD, and Miranda Farmer. It was thanks to a caregiver asking Robin to do her dissertation on FASD that a lot of the work that we're talking about has come about. So some of our collaborations include NACCHO, Derval Jurgen Health Services, Dr. Sandra Eads, Professor Harry Blagg, the Canada FASD Research Network, key Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal community, and professionals. So we've had 10 years of this connection, and we're working and we're producing results from those collaborations. So in November of 2021, we held the first international gathering of researchers focused on Indigenous Aboriginal issues and FASD research in Canada and Australia, called Decolonizing FASD. And actually, Robin and I did a presentation on decolonizing FASD and youth justice. And the webinar was called Weaving, Beating, and Braiding, Sharing Our Stories, Indigenous-Led Research in the Field of FASD. And it wasn't advertised. It was a small gathering of researchers, about 50 from Canada, about 50 from Australia, as a first start, just to see how that meeting went. It went very well. We've collaborated on the book, Decolonizing Justice for Aboriginal Youth with FASD. And I've got the book here, and I just want to point out that there's a link here. When I was here in 2019, there was an incident with the police where Miss Joyce Clark was actually shot and killed by the police. And that deeply impacted the community. And what came out of that, and I'll unpack that a bit, was that Ms. Clark was suspected to have FASD. And in fact, there's lots of documents in the media that suggest that. But what I want to tell you, what we did with that was we dedicated our book to Ms. Clark because we felt it was important that there be some justice come out of this situation. We have a forthcoming chapter, again, looking at what's happening in the Aboriginal space, colonial threads of FASD in Canada and Australia, in press right now. And I just want to point out that our commitment in Canada to working with Aboriginal scholars, and as you can see, everybody bolded here is an Indigenous scholar in our book called The Future of Indigenous Child Welfare on the Prairies in Canada. And we just want to share that with you and just say the fruits of our labor is that we have people like Dr. Michael Doyle, like Dr. Robin Williams, collaborating with us on our publications. And we have a commitment to Indigenous scholarship, which includes 7 books published by the Prairie Child Welfare Consortium since 2007 in the Voices from the Prairie series. And what we know in Canada is that the majority of Indigenous children live on the prairie provinces in Canada, and the highest rates of child welfare involvement are in those prairie provinces, and not dissimilar to what's happening in Western Australia and other jurisdictions. We've just finished a book chapter, and it's just published like last week, Mothering Children with FASD, Child Protection and Contested Spaces. And we have a forthcoming publication on Aboriginal kinship carers of children with FASD in Western Australia that is in press, that will be one of the first publications on this topic globally. Some of our current research that we've recently done, I was leading a co-lead of a project on FASD and suicidality. We have the highest rates of suicide in adolescents 13 to 17 years, and in adults transitioning to 18 to 24, and suicide risk and rate is much higher for individuals with FASD than the general population. And this has major implications for mental health supports. The other thing that we discovered in our research, because we interviewed caregivers, we interviewed professionals, we did lots of literature reviews, is that we discovered actually in our interviews with families, with caregivers, that there was a huge linkage between sleep problems and suicidality. And one participant, and we actually met with a group of adults who live with FASD, and one person in that focus group said, a lot of people don't want to die, they just don't want to live, and they don't want to live because life is too hard. But the other problem that happens is high risk behavior, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So that's some of our publications on that research. And what do we know about disability and suicidality from our scoping review? I think I can sum it up by saying FASD really is related to the disability adversity factor. FASD is a disability where adversity is common on many fronts, often with no relief and no safety net. And you'll see that when we unpack those cases. But you know, the psychosocial aspects of this include higher levels of stress, negative family experiences, fewer social supports, and greater victimization, lower academic performance, don't do well in school, increased high risk behavior, ongoing involvement with the justice system as children or as youth and adults, poor community connections. And so we need more information on FASD and mental health supports. Just quickly, can FASD put out a policy alert on children's rights in the child justice system? And the United Nations has stated that young people with disabilities should not be in the regular justice system. There's a number of documents that relate to this, but we know that the age of criminal responsibility in Australia is 10 years, and in Canada, it's 12 years of age. And we know that individuals with FASD face immense vulnerabilities in the justice system. So it is critical that we not only decolonize that system, but we advocate for the population involved with that system. You know, we recognize that there's a number of adverse outcomes that are related to child welfare involvement. What we do know from one of our research projects where we looked at where young people went after they turned 18 and exited the child welfare system, is that they often return to their biological families. But we know that these young people with FASD often get involved, who are in the child welfare system, get involved in the justice system, and that leads to the adult justice system. We have in Canada a child advocate system, and we have national child advocates in 12 of our 13 provinces and states. And what we did was we analyzed all of the child advocate reports over 20 years to look for evidence of FASD. We literally reviewed every report by every child advocate in Canada. We landed on 61 reports in which there was a total of 98 deaths. 67 of those children were Indigenous, which again is tied to the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in child welfare systems. But what we found, shockingly, was that FASD was noted in 17 of 98 deaths. and 5 of those young people were diagnosed and 12 were suspected. And so what we're seeing is young people who are suspected with FASD, it's noted in the record, but there's no follow through in terms of diagnosis. And so, you know, we have similar things happening in Canada as well, where we know we suspect FASD. So I think these systems, we need to follow through with at least screening and assessment. 90% of individuals with FASD have co-occurring mental health conditions, and life expectancy with FASD is much shorter than expected. In fact, most literature will tell you about 34 years. And the things that contribute to that include the sense of fear is not the same, impulsivity is a major risk, the engagement in high-risk behavior without realizing the consequences. One of the things we learned in our FASD and suicide research was people involved in very high-risk drug use, and in fact, workers telling us that the individuals they knew with FASD were telling them, don't give me a naloxone kit, don't revive me if I overdose. We were shocked to hear that. So high-risk substance use is a significant problem. So here's what I wanted to focus on is the high-profile cases in the media in Australia. I mean, I was aware of the Joyce Clark case when I was here and some other cases as well. So we're going to unpack a couple of these cases. I'm watching time. LCM case, Justice Ian Freckleton wrote an incredible paper about this case, and it was legal advocacy by the youth lawyer for a FASD assessment that led to a diagnosis which had a significant impact and was a mitigating factor in the sentencing. Very important work. The Newman case, family violence resulting in the death of an 18-year-old mother of 2 by 17-year-old partner with a confirmed FASD diagnosis, which led, I'll talk about the outcomes in a minute, tragic youth deaths in the Kimberleys in 2013, the case with the crocodile, which we'll unpack a bit. The youth had a FASD diagnosis. Miss Joyce Clark that I already talked about. Jean Gibson wrongfully imprisoned for manslaughter in 2017 for 5 years. And there was a recent report that I saw in the media, a 15-year-old boy with FASD spent 79 days in Fishbowl in Banksia. And he's now in Hakia prison, or maybe he's released now, I don't know the latest, but it was deemed better for him to be in an adult prison than the concerns noted where he was at Banksia. The Fogliani report, coroner's inquest in the Kimberley region on the deaths of 13 young children. So let's unpack the case of the youth death in the Kimberleys in it was 15. This young person was diagnosed shortly after birth, and we expect that a FASD diagnosis would lead to supportive care and FASD informed care by 10. And we profile this because this is not atypical. By 10, he had early signs of substance use with solvents. He had an almost fatal episode at age 11. He was a victim of sexual assault by age 11. He struggled in school. It was discovered he had significant developmental delays, but he had strengths in terms of music, guitar, drums, and loved music. And that was a really positive thing in his life. He was placed in a community setting close to family and cultural connections in April 2011. Ran away several times and ended up in a more remote community in La Jadar Bay. And he left the home intent on running away. In Sarah Linton's report, she noted that there was limited knowledge of FASD by the Department of Child Protection, but there were certainly efforts noted to gather information on FASD. The remote placement was to keep the child safe from solvent use, and no training on FASD was provided to the carers. And those are points 169 and points 170 in the report. It was the expert opinion of Dr. Raywin Much that the history of trauma and the FASD diagnosis played a significant role in the young person's death. But what happened was he ran away, he left the home, he was unfortunately caught out in the mangroves and was eventually, he died from being killed by a crocodile, an amputation, as well as some other injuries related to those events. So what are the consequences of FASD that factor in here? Impulsivity, failure to be able to understand the risks and consequences of his action. And the underlying message here is that the FASD diagnosis did not translate to FASD informed care. Here's the 15-year-old boy that was in the youth detention center and in Western Australia, and this was in the media, and the judge noted that the boy's experience of detention at Banksia Hill had been one of prolonged systematic dehumanization and deprivation. It has no rehabilitative element or effect and has been unjustly given. So we know that it is absolutely critical that we do things differently. Sorry, just go back to that. The other note here is that he saw the psychologist in the prison 39 times due to risk of suicide. The coroner's inquest into the Kimberley region on the deaths of 13 young children by Coroner Fogliani. Recommendations included universal screening for FASD during infant health assessments, although it seemed more reasonable in looking as well at Sarah Linton's report that, at least FASD screening within the first year of life. It's not always evident at birth. And that life events, developmental experiences, and behaviors have contributed to making these young people vulnerable to suicide. And it was heavily identified that FASD was considered to have a role. Even without diagnosis, there was concerns about FASD. There was the recommendation that FASD be supported within NDIS where that was possible. And there was a no FASD report on February 2nd, 2021 into the Royal Commission into Violence, Abuse, Neglect, and Exploitation of People with Disability, and FASD was featured in that report. So what are some of the lessons? FASD is complex and individualized care is needed. There's no formula for caring for individuals with FASD. There's some basic things around care, control, and safety, structure, routine, and stability. Those are the hallmarks of good care. Almost every case profiled in the media involved Aboriginal people. Clearly, FASD is not an Aboriginal problem. It reflects the disproportionate representation of Aboriginal people in child welfare and justice systems. Common thread, common colonial historical thread. The other common thread being noted is the lack of awareness and knowledge of FASD and the elevated risks for individuals with FASD, the lack of FASD-informed care, and recognizing that individuals with FASD need lifelong support to mediate those challenges. So each of those cases had an outcome, which you can see here. I don't need to read them all, but there was some very clear recommendations coming out of the Fogliani report, out of the Sarah Linton report, and it's just really important. These cases are asking us to pay attention and asking systems to do better. And the case for screening for FASD and child protection is really important because parental substance use is a primary reason driving their involvement of families with the child protection system. And we know that in homes where active substance use is going on, this is highly problematic. And we know that children with FASD experience high levels of adverse childhood experiences. An early intervention and diagnosis of FASD provides critical life infrastructure in a life pathway, which is really important. And as well, the NDIS system can be accessed before age 7, and it becomes a bit more complex after age 7. So that's a good reason for early diagnosis, assessment and diagnosis. The other critical factor in these young people's lives is time. Young people live their lives, they grow up, they live with their disability. They engage in life as any other person does. The problem is that when they hit adolescence, there's lots of problems, especially when they're not supported. And they're particularly vulnerable to mental health concerns, suicidality, exploring use of alcohol and or other drugs, substance use, and potential addiction. The other key issue is sexual health, and effective family planning is critical to consider as individuals with FASD as young women become pregnant and young men father children, and increasing the risk for intergenerational FASD. So lots of you working in any kind of human service can likely see a person with FASD. Whether you're in child protection, you think a child has a disability, you're a teacher, you work in a youth justice facility. There's lots of ways in which various professions intersect with FASD, maybe without recognizing it. So what needs to be considered? A call for FASD-informed care, professional knowledge and mandatory training of disability and FASD needs to be integrated into all human services, especially in our training programs. We need ongoing access and clinical infrastructure across the country for assessment and diagnosis on an ongoing basis, integrated into systems of care, similar to other disabilities that seem to get a lot of attention and seem to be regularly diagnosed. We need mandatory training, and we need to, I think the critical framework of social and emotional well-being certainly has a role to play here. In summary, no one discipline can take full responsibility for FASD, and we need a whole of community approach to respond and support children and youth, adults and families and communities living with this disability. The other important message is that individuals with FASD landed in this place through absolutely no fault of their own. It's not okay to blame women for alcohol use and pregnancy, because lots of things happen in women's lives. And actually, women need lots of support around prevention and health. We need a coordinated response in relation to policy and practice, because if it's embedded in policy and practice, it makes a difference in the lives of people. As a society, we have a responsibility to care for our most vulnerable members, and individuals with FASD certainly fall into that category. We need to help individuals with FASD overcome all of the barriers that they experience in accessing services, because there are many. And, you know, for example, an individual with FASD who doesn't show up for an appointment might actually need somebody to bring him to that appointment, or her. These are important things, and these are some of the subtleties and nuances of FASD that we need to take up as professionals. And finally, advocacy. It is the responsibility, therefore, of all systems caring for people with FASD to advocate on their behalf. Thank you. Lots of references, lots of different things. I know my time is past, and I will stop here.